Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into the soft golden glow of something unexpectedly fascinating. Beeswax. Imagine the flicker of a single flame dancing on the stone walls of a cold monastery, the heavy scent of incense and wax curling through the corridors. You're walking barefoot on worn slabs wrapped in itchy wool, carrying a stubby taper to find your way to morning prayers. You can't read the hour, but the wax is melting. That's your clock. You're probably not surviving long in this world, by the way. Between plague, famine, and the fact that your breakfast is literally porridge again, it's not looking good. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love seeing the sleepy little community grow. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a monastery now, early 13th century, maybe Cluny, maybe Canterbury. It's before sunrise, and already the beeswax candles are burning. The smell is sweet, a bit earthy, and somehow comforting in a place that smells mostly of damp robes and quiet suffering. These candles aren't just a luxury, they're a spiritual tool. You see, in the medieval Christian mind, beeswax symbolized purity because it was created by virgin worker bees. That's right. Even the insects were judged by their lifestyle choices. Lighting candles was an act of reverence. You'd process into the nave carrying a taper, muttering Latin, wax dripping on your sleeve. And unlike tallow, made from rendered animal fat, beeswax didn't stink. That alone made it the Chanel No. 5 of medieval lighting. Richer churches could afford it in bulk, bought from monasteries that kept vast apiaries. Poorer parishes, meanwhile, muddled through with yellowing tallow, the kind that smoked and spat and made everything smell like roast goat. Or worse. In castles, it was the same divide. Lords lit their feasts with beeswax, while the kitchen staff sweated under tallow flames. You didn't even need to see the chandelier to know what class you belonged to. You could smell it. Here's something delightfully weird. Some monasteries imposed strict candle regulations. In Cluniac traditions, for instance, specific numbers of candles were required for particular rites. 7 on Maundy Thursday, 12 on the altar for Easter, that sort of thing. And who enforced it? The sacristan. Imagine being the medieval candle cop. Historians still argue whether these strict candle counts had deeper theological meanings, or whether it was just monkish micromanagement. It could go either way. These were the same guys who once debated whether cheese counted as milk during Lent. Let's pause a moment in a peasant's cottage, just a one-room hovel, smoky and cramped. A single tallow lamp guttering in the corner, illuminating the dirt floor, and your barefoot uncle trying to carve a spoon. There's no beeswax here. It's too expensive. A full beeswax candle might cost you a day's wages, or more. Peasants usually lived with the dark and went to bed early. their schedules sync to the sun. There's a reason people had so many kids back then, nothing else to do after sunset, but in cities it was a different story. Candle makers formed guilds, especially in London and Paris. And guess what? There were two separate guilds, one for tallow chandlers and one for beeswax chandlers. The wax workers were richer, cleaner, and much less stinky. They supplied cathedrals, courts, and the occasional bougie merchant. Tallow guys handled everything else, and their workshops were famous for reeking like boiled pig. Weird aside, in some cities you weren't even allowed to make tallow candles inside the city walls. The smell was considered a public nuisance. So the poor had to buy their light from the outskirts and carry it back home before dark. Imagine commuting for your candles. Speaking of light, beeswax burned longer and more cleanly than anything else they had. That made it the only real option for scribes who needed to copy manuscripts by hand. Hour after hour of tiny Latin letters, bent over vellum, eyes straining in the golden flicker. That flicker? Priceless. And sometimes, just sometimes, a wealthy scribe might press a little too hard, and a droplet of wax would land smack in the margin of a sacred text. Instead of tossing the page, they'd incorporate it into the decoration. You might see a painted angel perched atop the dried wax blob, wings spread as if it belonged there all along. Efficiency through creativity. One final waxy twist before we dim this section out. In some remote villages, old women, let's call them folk healers to be polite, believed you could predict death by watching the shape of a candle's wax drip. If it ran straight down, your soul was safe. If it curled, well, start confessing. So the next time you light a candle, maybe it's vanilla scented, maybe it's just for ambiance. Remember, in the Middle Ages, that same gentle flame marked the boundary between wealth and poverty, sacred and profane, and sometimes even life and death. You stand at the edge of a cold, drafty great hall, the kind with tapestries clinging to the walls like half-hearted insulation and a throne that's more symbolic than comfortable. Before you, on a heavy oaken table, lies a document, vellum, not paper, of course. Paper's still a luxury here, something the East has and the West's just figuring out how to steal. But it's not the document that catches your eye. It's the wax. Thick, golden red, stamped with a design so intricate it looks like someone carved it with a needle. That, my friend, is the Queen's seal, and it means business. Royal beeswax seals weren't just decorative blobs. They were authentication, authority, and a little bit of magic, all rolled into one. If the king sent an order without his seal, it was just some dude with a quill and delusions of grandeur. But once that wax cooled, once the signet ring pressed into it with just the right pressure, it became law. Or at least something that would get you hanged if you disobeyed it. This isn't just about kings and queens either. Even minor nobles had their own personalized seals. Some were inherited, some were, let's say, creatively acquired. And forgeries? Oh yes, Seals were faked, stolen, or even melted down and reshaped, which is awkward because historians still argue whether any of the surviving seals from the 12th century are the real deal. Some suspect entire court charters were sealed posthumously, meaning the monarch was dead when they supposedly signed it. You've probably heard of signet rings, those chunky bands with engraved crests or initials. They weren't just status symbols. In a world without passwords or two-factor authentication, that wax seal was your blue check mark. Lose the ring? You'd better change your whole identity, or just flee to Flanders and start over as a barrel maker. Let's zoom in. You're watching a clerk, pale, overworked, probably named Edwin, carefully melt a stick of beeswax over a tiny flame. He holds it above the parchment and lets the drops fall with almost meditative focus. Then, before it cools, he presses the ring in. Not too hard, not too soft, just enough to leave a crisp impression of a lion or a fleur-de-lis, or maybe some overly ambitious family motto like ever upward, never yielding, even though the guy can't afford shoes. And beeswax wasn't chosen randomly. It had the perfect properties. It melted cleanly, cooled quickly, and held fine detail. Tallow was far too soft and crumbly, while resin, well, good luck getting that out of your robes if you spill it. Plus, wax could be tinted with natural pigments, red with cinnabar, green with verdigris, black with soot. Color-coded, medieval style. The act of sealing itself became ritualistic. Important messages were folded with elaborate techniques, some even folded like origami, so that breaking the seal without tearing the letter was almost impossible. In fact, entire studies exist today about these folding patterns. Yes, there are literally historians specializing in medieval envelope folding. Academia is weird. And here's a delightful detail. Wax seals were often attached to documents by a cord or strip of parchment known as a tag. The seal would dangle like a little pendant. In grand ceremonies, envoys would present sealed letters like sacred relics, holding them out with both hands, seal facing forward, as if to say, "Look, I didn't peek." Now, of course, there were ways around the system. Clever tricksters would soften the wax just enough to pull out the seal, read the letter, and then reseal it with a copy. Or, in some cases, they'd just heat a knife, cut the seal off clean, and reattach it later with fresh wax. It was basically the medieval version of marked as unread. Let's not forget about ecclesiastical seals. Bishops, abbots, even certain monasteries had their own wax seals, many depicting saints or scenes from Scripture. Some of these are breathtaking in detail, almost like miniature cameos. There's one from Durham that shows St. Cuthbert holding a fish, which sounds odd until you learn he was obsessed with eels, like medically obsessed, possibly unhealthily. But there's more. A few seals doubled as reliquaries, tiny wax capsules that contained slivers of bone or cloth touched by saints. Send a letter, bless your recipient, That's customer service. A quirky twist? Some nobles commissioned novelty seals. One 14th century French count had a seal shaped like a hunting dog mid-chase. Another noblewoman, Lady Marjorie of Lincoln, had hers made in the shape of her own shoe. Because why not? If you're going to spend your life navigating politics, at least make your paperwork fabulous. And it wasn't all fancy business. Local town guilds used wax seals for mundane things, approving apprenticeships, confirming deliveries of fish, authorizing ale weights. A poorly stamped seal could delay a shipment for weeks or spark a feud between two cheese sellers. You laugh, but there were actual riots over moldy cheese and improperly sealed beer barrels. To make matters more chaotic, the consistency of the wax itself varied. Some regions mixed in pine resin to stretch their supply. Others added chalk. The result? Seals that cracked, crumbled, or fell off in damp weather. Imagine mailing a royal command across Europe and having the seal flake off halfway there. Yes, Your Grace, the messenger swears it was signed, but the wax fell into a puddle near Ghent. Yet despite the fragility, these seals endured. Many survive today in museums, some still clinging to scraps of their original parchment. Their tiny, ancient fingerprints, each one tells a story, a declaration of war, a land grant, a marriage proposal, a shipping contract for 12 barrels of herring. Beeswax made those stories last. So next time you seal an envelope with a sticker or a wax stamp you bought on Etsy, just remember, you're part of a long, melty tradition of authority, artistry, and the occasional forged wine order. You shuffle into a cold, echoing chapel at the edge of dawn, robes swishing against your ankles, the air sharp with the smell of stone and incense. There are no pews, just benches or bare kneelers, and no overhead lights. Only candles. Rows and rows of slender, flickering beeswax tapers. Their glow warms the gloom, casting halos on painted saints and golden altarpieces. You find your place, bow your head, and try not to sneeze as a bit of smoke curls up your nose. Welcome to the morning liturgy. Candles in the Middle Ages weren't just sources of light. They were spiritual instruments seen as symbols of the divine. In churches, they marked sacred moments. Their flames stood in for the eternal light of Christ, their clean, burning nature representing purity, their beeswax bodies the offering of the faithful. And while you could use tallow candles in your kitchen, in church, only beeswax would do. God apparently had expensive taste. In Catholic Europe, especially before the Reformation, candles were used to structure worship itself. Every altar had to have at least 2. The wealthier churches often showed off with 6 or more, depending on the occasion. Candle counts weren't random. Certain feast days required more. On Candlemas, for instance, the entire congregation would bring candles from home to be blessed by the priest. That's right. Bring your own candle day, once a year, to spiritually recharge your lighting stash. And once those candles were blessed, they were thought to have real power. People kept them at home and burned them during storms to ward off lightning. Others used them to ease childbirth or protect a dying soul. If you've ever tried lighting a candle during a thunderstorm with one hand while holding on to your midwife with the other, congrats. You and a 14th century villager have something in common. Now, let's talk shapes. Not all candles were your classic stick form. Some were twisted into spirals, others braided like bread loaves. In major ceremonies, coronations, processions, funerals, they used massive pillars of wax, sometimes taller than a man. One record from 1399 mentions a Paschal candle weighing over 80 pounds. It took multiple monks just to carry it in procession. You can imagine someone pulling a shoulder muscle in the name of divine illumination. But how did they make all this wax into something usable? Well, you started with a beeswax cake, an ugly lump that smelled faintly of forest and honey. It was melted in clay pots and carefully poured over wicks, often made of linen or rushes. Medieval candle-making was a layered process, literally. Wicks were dipped again and again into molten wax until the candle reached the right thickness. Think of it like medieval cake pop assembly, only less edible and more flammable. And of course, who was doing all this work? You guessed it, the monks. Monasteries ran large-scale beeswax operations, with whole buildings dedicated to candle production. There were candle houses, wax presses, and rooms for straining impurities. Wax had to be clean. No dead bees, no leaves, no grit. It took an obsessive level of filtering. The Benedictines naturally made it an art form. One abbot even wrote a short treatise on the proper boiling of wax. It's very boring. Do not read it before operating machinery. Historians still argue whether the abundance of candles in some abbeys reflected genuine piety or just competition. Some abbots were known to boast about how many candles they burned during Easter Mass, as if it were a spiritual flex. Oh, your abbey uses 200 tapers? How quaint! We used 500, and 2 monks passed out from the heat. Even in death, candles followed you. During medieval funerals, it was customary for mourners to carry long beeswax tapers as they walked behind the coffin. Some families went all out, buying candles that burned for hours or having them carved with crosses or Latin prayers. After the burial, those candles might be donated to the local church, or, more commonly, taken home and relit whenever someone in the family got a bit too sneezy. And here's a fringe belief to round out the glow. In some parts of Eastern Europe, people believed that beeswax candles could carry prayers directly to heaven, but only if they were lit in complete silence. One whispered word and the magic fizzled out. Imagine the pressure during a vigil. You're holding a candle and trying not to cough. The priest staring. Someone's stomach growls. Heaven's phone line disconnected. Some candles were carved with specific intentions. A taper might be blessed for the healing of bone, another against storms, and yet another to aid the digestion of overly rich food. Yes, Even in medieval times, someone regretted eating that third roasted swan leg. Now, don't think peasants were completely left out of the waxy blessings. On rare occasions, like during plagues or Marian festivals, churches would hand out small wax figurines shaped like lambs, crosses, or the Virgin herself. People tucked them into beds, carried them during travel, or melted them during prayers for the sick. One 15th century English villager swore that melting a wax lamb over his brother's foot cured his gout. Whether it worked or not, well, he stopped complaining, possibly because the lamb got stuck to his foot. As we leave this candlelit chapel behind, your senses are slightly overwhelmed. The scent of beeswax clings to your robe. Your eyes are still adjusting to real darkness, and somewhere in the distance the bell tolls prime. Another day begins, but the wax, that golden glowing substance, has already worked its quiet magic, melting silently into the shadows of another medieval morning. You're squatting in a field, elbow deep in mud, trying to string together what passes for armor. It's damp, everything smells faintly of turnips, and you're fairly certain your sword is more decorative than deadly. But you're a soldier now, or at least you've been told you are. You're part of a levy, called up by your local lord to go whack some other poor farmer over a border dispute. And here's the thing. Before you even set foot on the battlefield, beeswax has already made itself useful. Let's start with your gear. Chainmail, if you're lucky enough to have it, rusts faster than a peasant's hopes in the rain. But if you rub it down with a beeswax and oil mixture, that metal stays slick, protected, and vaguely lemon-scented. Okay, maybe not lemon, more like barnyard floral. Still, it helps. Beeswax sealed armored joints, kept exposed bits from sticking together, and when mixed with pitch, made a serviceable waterproofing agent. Handy when you're camping in the rain for 3 days, waiting for someone to blow a horn. Your leather straps, also waxed, dry leather cracks, and cracked leather snaps. That could mean your helmet falls off mid-charge. Not ideal. So a bit of beeswax rubbed along the straps keeps things supple. A 14th century knight might have spent as much time tending to his gear as a modern soldier spends cleaning a rifle. Except his cleaning kit included a candle and a dog hair cloth. Now picture your bowman friend next to you, tightening his longbow. He's waxing his bowstring, because frayed strings don't fire arrows. They just slap your nose. A thin smear of beeswax helps the string stay taut and dry. Without it, the damp English air would render the bow about as useful as a wet shoelace. And speaking of arrows, let's go deeper. Fletchers used wax to attach feathers to the shaft, sealing the binding thread so it wouldn't unravel mid-flight. For serious archers, wax wasn't optional. It was part of every arrow's birth. One misplaced drop, though, and the flight was ruined. Somewhere, a medieval Fletcher is still muttering about that one arrow that veered left and hit a goose. Historians still argue whether beeswax was widely used on arrowheads for waterproofing or merely for easier storage. Some say archers dipped arrowheads in wax and pitch before wrapping them in cloth, keeping them dry and rust-free. Others believe the wax was added later, a romantic modern invention. Either way, there's some evidence that elite archers had kits with wax cakes tucked between their spare cords and wine skins. And if you're wondering how this wax got to the battlefield, well, quartermasters knew. They packed it by the lump, often next to soap, oil, and resin. Some armies even issued it like rations, a little cube wrapped in cloth, barely bigger than a plum, could serve 20 purposes in a pinch. But it wasn't all about maintenance. Wax had battlefield flair too. Let's say you're in charge of a banner. Big, showy, terrifying. Your house's sigil painted onto heavy cloth. That banner might be stiffened at the edges with beeswax-soaked linen, so it held its shape even when wet. A floppy banner? That's bad prayer. People need to know which horseman not to stab. And here's a weirder use: sealing scrolls of battle orders. Sure, this sounds obvious, but sometimes commanders sealed not just the outside, but the inside of the message, forcing the reader to melt wax at specific breaks to read the instructions. The idea was to prevent overeager lieutenants from reading all the orders at once, or, skipping to the good part where they got promoted. Occasionally, wax served more macabre functions. In at least one battle chronicle from the 100 Years' War, knights used wax to waterproof the felt padding inside their helmets. Without it, sweat and rain would soak in, freezing solid overnight. One poor guy reportedly cracked his helm liner when it froze like a medieval popsicle. Cue the world's saddest clunk. And siege warfare? Don't even get me started. Beeswax was a minor ingredient in Greek fire variants, those early incendiaries that terrified people because they didn't go out when doused with water. Most Greek fire recipes are lost or deliberately misleading, thanks Byzantines, but some mention wax as a thickening agent. Whether it was truly effective or just made everything smell faintly like burnt honey is still debated. Let's not forget the humble foot soldier. You've got a hole in your boot. You can try stuffing it with straw, or you can smear wax around the seam. If you're desperate, and let's face it, you'll do both. Some soldiers carried a waxed cloth wrap, used to line boots or serve as makeshift gloves. It kept fingers from freezing and, in theory, helped prevent the spread of trench rot. In practice, probably just made your hands sticky. And while we're deep in the mud, picture this. Your commanding knight gets a bright idea. He wants his shield emblazoned with a gold lion, but he's out of paint. Enter wax. Melted beeswax mixed with ochre or powdered lead could serve as a makeshift pigment, not long-lasting, but flashy for the tournament. That lion might not last the battle, but hey, it'll look good for the first charge. One more oddity. Some commanders kept wax tokens to distribute among troops, small discs stamped with the family crest or battle cry. They weren't currency exactly, but more like rally markers or promissory chips for ale after the fight. A kind of medieval poker chip with significantly more stabbing involved. So, While beeswax didn't win battles, it certainly helped keep things from falling apart. Literally. And as you sit in your muddy tent, rubbing wax onto your cracked boot and listening to your tent mate snore like a dying bear, you might take a moment to appreciate this soft, golden substance. It's not glamorous, but it's what's keeping your gear dry, your arrows straight, and your armor from welding itself shut with rust. You, soldier, are basically held together by bees. You're staring into a polished metal mirror, which is really just a dull, warped disc that mostly shows you how tired you look and how unfortunate your haircut is. Still, you're trying to get ready for the feast tonight. There's goose on the menu, a bard with a questionable lute, and, if you're lucky, someone to impress. So you reach for your secret weapon, a tiny jar of beeswax balm. Welcome to the rarely discussed world of medieval beauty, and yes, beeswax was right at the heart of it. Forget Sephora. If you lived in the Middle Ages and wanted to look your best, you made your own beauty products or paid an apothecary who definitely also sold rat poison. Beeswax was a common base in creams, balms, and ointments. It added consistency, helped hold herbal ingredients together, and crucially, it didn't rot. That's more than we can say for most things in medieval bathrooms. Take skincare, for instance. You wanted soft, supple cheeks. Mix rose water with beeswax and a touch of animal fat. Slather it on, avoid mirrors, and hope for the best. One 14th century French recipe even included crushed pearls, because nothing says glowing skin like rubbing powdered oyster jewelry into your pores. Beeswax was also used to smooth rough hands. Farming, weaving, and tanning leather were hard on skin, so waxy salves helped create a sort of barrier. The medieval idea of moisturizer, essentially, and it doubled as a hair pomade. Men slicked down their hair or beards with a blend of wax and oil. Just don't stand too close to the fire, or you might go from dashing to flambe in under 10 seconds. Historians still argue whether these beeswax-based products were used more by the upper classes or whether peasants had their own DIY equivalents. Some records suggest even rural folk used waxy salves, especially for chapped lips or cracked heels. Others argue that most of this beauty regime stuff was strictly for the wealthy, those who didn't have to spend every waking hour elbow-deep in turnip soil. And speaking of wealthy, nobles, especially women at court, had entire beauty routines involving beeswax. One surviving recipe from 15th century Italy combines beeswax with lavender oil and ground almonds, designed to soften skin and mask the smell of sweat, chamber pots, and poorly washed underthings. Glamorous, no? But beeswax didn't stop at skin. It was also used in cosmetics. Medieval women aspired to a pale, smooth complexion. Pale because it meant you weren't toiling outside like a serf. So they'd use beeswax-based foundations tinted with white lead or chalk. Yes, lead. Because what's a little neurological damage when your cheekbones look amazing Some formulas mixed beeswax with vine ash or crushed berries to create a subtle blush. And lip stains? Yep, plant dyes suspended in waxy salve, applied with a cautious hand. If you're thinking, this sounds suspiciously like modern lipstick, you're right. The packaging's changed, but the basics haven't. And in case you're wondering, yes, there were medieval makeup fails. One French countess reportedly had a beeswax-based face cream that melted off during a feast, leaving her with streaky cheeks and a waxy chin by dessert. The chronicles didn't record whether she laughed it off or summoned someone for execution, but one imagines it wasn't her best night. Men weren't immune to the beautifying power of beeswax either. Nobles used wax to tame mustaches, polish boots, and condition leather gloves so they looked supple and dramatic when slapping someone across the face during an argument. One German baron famously carried a waxed comb in a little ivory case, which he whipped out with theatrical flair whenever the conversation dulled. There's even evidence that beeswax was used as a kind of proto-deodorant. Some recipes combined wax with powdered herbs like sage, thyme, and rosemary. You'd apply it under the arms or to your linen underlayers. The scent lasted about as long as a small sneeze, but it was better than nothing, probably. A fringe tidbit for you. Some medieval performers and courtiers reportedly used beeswax to smooth their eyebrows or shape them into dramatic arches. One Italian poet described a rival's brows as so waxed and perfect they looked like Gothic arches. Insult or compliment? Jury's out. And while we're on the fringe, let's talk about wigs. Yes, medieval Europe dabbled in hairpieces, especially among clergy who wanted to appear pious and fashionable. Beeswax helped attach false hair or shape intricate braids. In some French courts, ladies even affixed waxed veils to hair cones, creating towering headpieces that doubled as architectural statements. Imagine carrying a beeswax-supported hat that made you look 3 feet taller and pray you didn't walk near a candle. But here's where things get charmingly weird. In some rural villages, wax was mixed with honey and applied as a kind of facial mask meant to draw out the humors and improve clarity. If that sounds vaguely like modern spa treatments, congratulations. You just discovered the medieval version of self-care. All you needed was a hive, a pot, and about 4 hours of free time between plagues, and when all else failed, when your balm melted, your blush smudged, your waxed brow unraveled, there was always the candle trick. Some nobles allegedly carried a tiny beeswax candle stub in their pouch. If they needed a touch-up on the go, they'd melt a drop on their fingers and rub it onto lips or cheeks for a quick glow. Yes, the medieval version of a highlighter stick was literally a candle. Genius or dangerous? Possibly both. So tonight, as you admire yourself in your wobbly mirror, hair slicked, cheeks glowing, and your linen freshly scrubbed with lavender wax balm, remember this. You're not just a courtier. You're part of a centuries-old tradition of trying to look slightly better than reality permits. With the help of bees, you're hunched over a desk that smells faintly of goat, squinting at a piece of vellum that refuses to lay flat. Your quill is scratchy, your fingers are ink-stained, and your candle keeps sputtering with every breeze from the broken window. Welcome to the scriptorium, a place where the silence is sacred, the ink is expensive, and beeswax? Beeswax is absolutely everywhere. Illuminated manuscripts didn't just happen. They were the result of obsessive work, scribes and illuminators laboring over pages for weeks, even months. Every dot, swirl, gold leaf accent, deliberate. And beeswax? It was like the medieval version of duct tape and primer combined. First things first, the parchment. This wasn't paper, it was treated animal skin, often calf or sheep. It came stiff, wrinkled, and prone to curling. To make it manageable, scribes would rub it with a mix of beeswax and powdered pumice, smoothing out the surface and reducing absorbency. Think of it as prepping your canvas, except your canvas used to be someone's dinner. This beeswax polishing step helped quills glide smoothly and prevented ink from bleeding. You're aiming for precise strokes here, not abstract expressionism. Every letter needed to be crisp, even if the guy reading it later couldn't tell his Psalms from his Proverbs. Now look closer. See that tiny spot where the ink is a little darker? That's a correction. Mistakes happened, and while scraping the vellum was the most common way to fix errors, beeswax had its role too. Some scribes melted a minuscule amount of wax into the scrape to resurface it before rewriting. A little secret patch job, like spackling a wall, but holier.
And when the illuminator came along, usually a different person entirely, they had their own wax-based tricks. Mixing gold leaf glue, add a touch of beeswax for smoother texture. Want your colors to pop? A thin beeswax glaze gave depth and sheen like a medieval Instagram filter. But the real magic happened with the wax tablets. Before the scribe committed anything to expensive vellum, he practiced, not on scratch paper, on reusable beeswax tablets. Imagine 2 wooden panels, hollowed out and filled with blackened beeswax. Using a stylus, basically a fancy stick, you'd etch your words into the wax. Didn't like what you wrote? Smooth it over with the flat end of the stylus and start again. Medieval Control+Z. Monks used them for note-taking, list-making, and even gossip. One surviving tablet includes a complaint about soup being thin as baptism water. Harsh words from Brother Gregory, but fair. Historians still argue whether wax tablets were used to draft full texts or just fragments. Some believe entire sermons were composed on wax before being committed to parchment. Others think the tablets were more like post-it notes, quick, informal, and likely to be smoothed out without a second thought. Either way, the wax tablet was an essential tool, especially in a world where paper was rare and memory was not to be trusted. Fun fringe fact:
In colder monasteries, beeswax tablets had to be warmed gently before use. Too cold, and the wax cracked. Too warm, and it turned to goo. Imagine trying to revise your homily only to find it has melted into a tiny puddle of Latin nonsense. And it didn't stop there. Some records show that scribes used beeswax to temporarily fix gold leaf in place before burnishing. Gold was expensive, delicate, and constantly trying to flake off and stick to your sleeve. A dab of wax solved that, until someone got too ambitious and accidentally fused an entire St. John into their lap. There were even wax seals within manuscripts. Royal copies of legal documents were often embedded with wax directly on the page, not just dangling from a ribbon. This was risky, of course. Wax melts. So the books had to be kept cool and upright. One archivist in Bruges reportedly fainted when a priceless seal fused 2 folios together during a summer heat wave. And let's talk about storage. Finished books, especially in large abbeys, were often shelved horizontally. But to prevent slippage or moisture damage, monks sometimes rubbed beeswax along the edges of bindings or shelf surfaces. It kept the book snug and discouraged insects, who apparently didn't appreciate the taste. A lovely oddity here, some particularly pious scribes would carve tiny crosses into their wax tablets before writing, believing the act would protect them from error or heresy. Considering the consequences of theological typos back then, you can understand the extra precautions. One poor fellow in Mainz allegedly misspelled a verse from Psalms and ended up fasting for 2 weeks to purge the sin of carelessness. Yes, even sloppy handwriting had consequences. Beeswax couldn't save him, but it did help the next guy fix the page. And the scent. Let's not forget that. Scriptoriums often smelled of warm wax, ink, vellum, and dust. A weirdly comforting mix. In winter, when your ink froze and your fingers felt like wood, that waxy smell meant light, warmth, and something to do. Without beeswax, the entire medieval manuscript tradition might have fallen apart. Literally. Pages warped, gold flaked, ink bled, and nothing lasted. So next time you flip through a medieval manuscript, digitally, let's be honest, remember that it wasn't just skill and prayer that made it possible. Somewhere, behind the gilded letters and holy illuminations, there was a humble little disk of beeswax, melted just enough to make art last for centuries. You duck into the cramped corner of a shadowy shop, part herb stall, part miracle emporium, and the scent nearly knocks you out. A heady mix of rosemary, vinegar, wine-soaked bandages, old leather, and something vaguely melted. This is no ordinary market stall. You're in an apothecary's lair, where medicine, magic, and total guesswork blend into tiny jars and handwritten scrolls. And tucked among the powders, tinctures, and dried lizard bits, you guessed it, beeswax. In the medieval world, the line between doctor and wizard was often just a matter of costume. You could wear a hood and mutter in Latin, or wear a robe and mutter in Greek. Either way, people came to you when they were desperate. And beeswax? It was everywhere in this medical gray zone. First, there were salves. Wax made the perfect base, malleable when warm, solid when cool, clean burning and long-lasting. Mix it with olive oil and throw in something vaguely medicinal, comfrey, marigold, crushed snail, and boom, you had a balm. Apply it to burns, cuts, rashes, or invisible humors of the skin. Whether it worked, that depended more on faith than science, but at least it smelled nice. One common remedy was a beeswax thyme salve for wounds. You'd melt wax gently, mix in thyme, believed to ward off infection and spirits alike, and apply it to an injury still sticky with blood. It sealed the cut, kept dirt out, and didn't sting like vinegar-based tonics. One 12th century battlefield manual even recommended carrying a wax salve wrapped in parchment for quick use on the field. Soldiers called it healer's honey, even though it technically contained no honey. Historians still argue whether beeswax truly improved healing or was just a convenient delivery method. Some say its sealing properties created a sterile barrier long before germ theory. Others insist it was just another sticky placebo. But in a world where surgeries were done without anesthesia and the success rate of tooth pulling hovered near coin toss, anything that didn't actively kill you was considered a win. Let's not forget the poultices. Beeswax gave body to sticky plant mixtures, helping them stay in place when wrapped in linen and slapped onto whatever body part was considered imbalanced. Whether it was a sore knee or a wandering spleen, there was a poultice for that. Often warmed over coals, they were applied with solemn chants and the hope that no one died before the recipe finished cooking. And now for something extra medieval: exorcism salves. In parts of Eastern Europe, wax mixed with herbs and holy water was applied to the chest or forehead of the afflicted, which is a polite way of saying anyone behaving weirdly. It was believed the warmth of the wax would draw out the bad spirit, while the scent of sage or hyssop would drive it away. If that didn't work, the patient was usually dunked in a river. Medical options were limited. A fringe tidbit here. In some monasteries, beeswax was even used to seal medicine containers and protect pills from spoiling. These weren't capsules like today, more like tiny beads of compressed herbs, honey, and clay, sealed with a wax coating to preserve their virtue. You'd swallow them whole, wax and all, and hope your stomach didn't revolt. Beeswax also found its way into dental care, if you can call it that. Some early prosthetic dentures were glued together with beeswax mixtures, and a few desperate souls even tried stuffing wax into tooth cavities to ease pain. It dulled the ache, sure, until it melted during soup. And then it didn't. Oh, and earwax? Not unrelated. There are medieval records of beeswax being used to soften hardened earwax, like fighting wax with wax. A few drops melted and cooled, then inserted gently into the ear. One Italian physician claimed it tickled the devil from the skull. Whether that's a metaphor or a horrifying description of what happened next, we'll never know. And what about childbirth? Midwives often carried wax salves scented with rose or lavender to calm laboring women. Some recipes claim to soften the gateway of life. Their words, not mine, by warming the skin and easing muscle tension. In reality, it probably did very little beyond smelling like a pleasant distraction. Still, in the agony of a medieval birth, even that was probably worth a few extra shillings. But wait, it gets weirder. Some apothecaries believed that demons could inhabit wax itself. Melting it with holy herbs, they said, released trapped spirits. One 14th century manual recommends burning a wax figure shaped like a frog to cure stomach cramps, because the humors of the belly are deceitful and must be frightened into order. The science, not sound. The drama, spectacular. There were also charm sachets, small pouches of wax mixed with herbs and animal hair, sewn into garments or hung from cribs. Supposedly, they warded off illness and bad dreams. Some had little wax discs with crosses carved in them, or symbols representing the sun. A few even had inscriptions that read like very polite threats to wandering spirits. And for the final flair, wax used in preservation. High-born families sometimes sealed dried flowers, relics, or sacred bones in wax casings, stored in reliquaries or amulets. The idea was to preserve the essence of the object, its power, by protecting it from air and sin. One noblewoman reportedly carried a wax-encased toenail of St. Catherine around her neck for 40 years. It allegedly protected her from fever. Whether it protected her from fashion is another matter. So, as you step out of the apothecary's shop, clutching your beeswax stoppered vial and trying not to trip on the cobblestones, remember, in a world without microscopes or antibiotics, beeswax offered something rare: stability. It bound, sealed, soothed, and sometimes even healed, depending on who you asked. Was it magic, medicine, or just a really useful byproduct of buzzing bugs? Maybe all three. You're in the back of a smoky tavern, leaning a little too close to the fire, the scent of ale and sweat clinging to your cloak. Someone nearby is tuning a lute, poorly, and across the room a merchant with ink-stained fingers is unrolling a scroll. You squint. It's not just a list of goods, it's a map. And beside it, a strange little lump of golden material, half-melted, sweet-smelling, pressed into a stamped disc. That's not decoration, that's beeswax, and it's the unsung hero of medieval trade. See? Commerce in the Middle Ages was messy. Roads were bad, currencies varied wildly, and about half the people you met were trying to cheat you. So how did you make trade work? You needed consistency, trust, and a way to mark goods as legitimate. enter beeswax. Let's start with shipping. When merchants packed goods, textiles, spices, wine, salt, or whatever else could survive a bumpy cart ride, they used wax seals to guarantee authenticity. A merchant's personal seal, pressed into a lump of beeswax on a crate, acted like a promise. I pack this. I own this. I vouch for this. Break the seal before it arrived. The buyer could reject the shipment, no questions asked. Even letters of credit and promissory notes were sealed. In a time when not everyone could write, a seal was your signature. Medieval trade guilds often had their own seal presses, usually kept under lock and key. Some even chained them to desks. Lose the seal stamp and your business could collapse overnight. But wax wasn't just about authority. It was also functional. Let's say you're shipping spices from Venice to Bruges. Those need to stay dry and uncontaminated. So, before sealing the barrels, you drizzle melted beeswax around the lid seam. It hardens into a waterproof lock. If someone tries to open it, they'll crack the seal, and you'll know. Think of it like a tamper-evident sticker, only tastier if you're into chewing candles. Now step into the market stalls themselves. You're selling cheese, which has been lovingly wrapped in linen and sealed with a dollop of wax stamped with a goat's head. This tells your buyer the cheese comes from your farm, not that shady guy downriver whose cows eat swamp grass. Branding mattered. Some wax seals even used color coding. Green for spring cheese, red for autumn, black for aged wheels that could knock out a grown man. Historians still argue whether these seals were legally binding or just marketing flair. In some port cities, sealed goods carried extra taxes or exemptions, depending on their guild affiliation. Others believe seals were more like medieval Yelp reviews. If it's got the wax pig on it, it's good. If not, don't eat it in front of company. And speaking of marketing flair, some traders got very creative. One German cloth merchant used wax stamps shaped like stars. A Flemish ale seller used tiny wax beer mugs. One apothecary even used wax skulls, presumably to scare off competitors or make his herbal stomach powder seem thrillingly dangerous. Let's not forget the role of beeswax in the goods themselves. It was a tradable commodity, sold by weight or volume, often molded into cakes stamped with the region of origin. English wax was prized for its purity. Russian wax was harder and darker, sometimes used for more industrial purposes. And Cypriot beeswax? That was the champagne of wax, pale, fragrant, and expensive. Some merchants traveled only to buy wax. They'd load it in barrels or wrap it in cloth for transport. And because beeswax doesn't spoil, it was one of the few products that could survive long journeys without becoming soup or fungus. That made it reliable, a rarity in medieval logistics. A fringe tidbit for you. In the Baltic trade routes, slabs of wax were sometimes used in barter, literally traded for salt, furs, or amber. One chronicler from the Hanseatic League noted a deal where 20 pounds of wax was swapped for a silver mirror
one swan, and a very agreeable fur hat. Economists today are still scratching their heads over that exchange rate. Even small-town artisans got in on the act. Candle makers bought wax in bulk, sometimes from beekeepers, sometimes from monasteries. They'd test its purity by snapping a cold chunk. If it cracked clean, it was good. If it bent like cheese, it was probably cut with tallow. Cheating in the wax trade was common, and buyers developed all sorts of sniffing, tasting, and poking rituals to verify quality. One Italian buyer reportedly bit into a wax cake before every purchase. Risky move, depending on who was watching. And of course there was the black market. Stolen wax, especially monastic wax, was big business. A barrel of beeswax could be worth more than a mule. Some thieves melted down stolen church candles and resold the wax under fake merchant seals. Others scraped seals off legitimate goods, melted them, and restamped them to mask the origin. One 15th century French regulation warned, "No wax shall be repoured or restamped, save in the presence of 2 guild witnesses and 1 honest monk." Yet, for all this sneaky business, beeswax remained a staple of respectable commerce. Some guild halls even lit ceremonial candles made from the first wax sold in spring, blessed by a priest, of course, because nothing says good quarterly projections like lighting a holy taper and hoping no one dies of dysentery. Even as paper money began to emerge and metal coins became more standardized, beeswax held its ground. It didn't rust, didn't spoil, and left a mark wherever it went. That's more than most traveling merchants could say. So as you watch the merchant in the tavern roll up his map and tuck his wax seal back into its little pouch, think about all the journeys that tiny lump of wax will make. From cart to crate, from hand to hand, it will hold promises, protect deals, and outlast even the finest parchment. It's not flashy, it's not loud, but it's reliable, and in the Middle Ages, that made it priceless. You've just stepped inside a modest but bustling workshop. The floorboards creak, shelves sag under the weight of small molds, brushes, pigments, and peculiar tools with unclear purposes. And perched at the center of this medieval chaos is a rotating wheel covered in a thin film of beeswax. No, you're not in an apothecary or a candle shop. You're in an artist's studio. And the wax isn't just for sealing or scent. It's the foundation of a lost art, encaustic and wax sculpture. Let's start with something that may surprise you. Medieval artists didn't just paint with oils or egg tempera. There was a lesser-known technique inherited from Roman times called encaustic painting, using hot beeswax mixed with pigments to create vivid, long-lasting images. Think of it like painting with lava, if lava smelled faintly of honey and required constant reheating. The process was labor-intensive. First, artists melted beeswax over coals, then stirred in colored powders, iron oxide for red, copper for green,
lapis lazuli for that rare ultramarine blue, assuming you had the coin. The wax had to be the right temperature. Too hot, and it smoked or discolored. Too cold, and it hardened on the brush mid-stroke. This wasn't just painting, it was a race against cooling physics. Once applied, the artist would reheat the surface gently with a glowing metal spatula or coal pan, fusing the layers of wax into a seamless skin. Done right, the result shimmered, translucent, luminous, almost otherworldly. Done wrong, it cracked, ran, or caught fire. Artistic risk. Medieval edition. Now, historians still argue whether encaustic painting remained widespread during the Middle Ages or faded into obscurity until revived later. Some scholars believe it survived in monastery workshops and Byzantine churches. Others think it was more myth than method. But surviving icons suggest at least a few artists braved the heat. Of course, wax's artistic potential didn't stop at painting.
Sculpture, especially effigies, made heavy use of beeswax. Ever been to a royal funeral in the 1300s? Probably not. Bit late for that. If you had, you might have seen a life-sized wax replica of the deceased, lying in state atop the coffin, dressed in real clothes and sometimes wearing a crown. These weren't Halloween decorations. They were called funeral effigies. Crafted by court artisans, they were meant to preserve the dignity of the royal dead, especially if the real body had become less than photogenic. The wax face was modeled from life, or post-mortem if you were lucky, with glass eyes, human hair, and the eerie stillness of a museum doll. The practice peaked in the 14th and 15th centuries, and some of these wax faces still survive in museum vaults, cracked, sunken, but weirdly expressive. A fringe detail. Some noble families commissioned wax statues of living members to be stored in family chapels or crypts. They weren't always flattering. One Italian widow ordered a wax likeness of her late husband with eyes lowered in repentance, even though he'd never repented anything. That's one way to win an argument after death. Back in the artist's workshop, wax also served as a modeling medium, used to shape small figures, scenes, and reliefs before committing to stone or metal. Sculptors made maquettes, preliminary models, from wax because it was malleable, detailed, and relatively cheap. Need to test a saint's halo or a knight's scowl? Wax first, marble later. And let's not forget lost wax casting, also called Sire Perdue, which changed the game for metalwork. Here's how it worked. You sculpt your figure in beeswax, say a saint holding a book. You coat it in clay, creating a solid mold around the wax. You fire the mold in a kiln. The wax melts and drains out, hence lost. You pour molten metal, usually bronze, into the empty cavity. Once cooled, you smash the mold and reveal your metal statue. This technique allowed for intricate details, flowing robes, delicate fingers, expressive faces. Some of the greatest medieval reliquaries, those ornate containers for
saintly body parts, were made using this exact method. Beeswax wasn't just a sculptor's sketchpad. It was the beginning of the final masterpiece. A famous example? The Golden Virgin of Amiens, crafted in part using lost wax casting techniques starting from a wax model. That serene face, those elegant folds in her robe, all first sculpted by a very patient artist and a very patient lump of wax. And here's something even stranger. Wax was used to replicate wounds. In medical illustration, some surgeons created wax models of injuries to show students what an arrow wound or sword gash actually looked like. These models, made from tinted wax and sometimes embedded with threads or bone, gave future surgeons something to study without needing a fresh corpse. Consider it the world's squishiest textbook. There were even devotional wax scenes, tiny dioramas of the Nativity, the Crucifixion, or saints performing miracles, made entirely of colored wax and tucked into wooden boxes like sacred doll houses. Popular in German and Austrian households, they let you carry a bit of the sacred with you, assuming it didn't melt en route. And yes, art fraud was a thing. Some less than reputable artisans made fake relics by embedding wax bones or holy dust into wax figurines, selling them to gullible pilgrims. One monk famously created a wax thumb of St. Andrew that turned out to be part of an old candlestick. He was sent to a different abbey on permanent silence duty. So, as you stand in that workshop, watching an apprentice blow gently over a still warm wax face, or a sculptor etch delicate scroll work into a wax saint's robes, consider this. Art wasn't always about permanence.
Sometimes it was about transition, about forming something in wax, not because it would last forever, but because it could become something else. A painting, a statue, a devotion, a lie. Beeswax, soft and golden, was the material of transformation. And in a world obsessed with the divine and the decaying, that made it art's most essential secret. You're standing in the dim nave of a towering stone cathedral. The air smells of old incense, wet stone, and melting wax. Candles flicker in iron holders, their flames barely swaying despite the cold. The glow doesn't really illuminate so much as carve shadows out of the dark. And yet, it's beautiful. Sacred, even. This is the Middle Ages' most atmospheric use of beeswax, the divine light of God. Candles were everywhere in medieval religious life. They burned in churches, chapels, shrines, cathedrals, monasteries, even in the hands of the dying. And they weren't made of just any wax. No, these holy lights demanded the purest source, beeswax, not tallow, never tallow. That stuff smelled like meat stew gone wrong and smoked like a chimney. Only beeswax burned with a clean, steady flame worthy of illuminating the Word. Churches didn't just use beeswax, they consumed it by the ton. One major cathedral could burn through hundreds of pounds a year. Monasteries kept ledgers tracking wax purchases like sacred spreadsheets. Some abbeys even had their own beehives to maintain supply. In fact, part of a monk's duties,
might include beekeeping, not just for honey, but to fuel the lamps of prayer. And candles weren't just practical, they were deeply symbolic. Light, in Christian theology, represented purity, divine truth, and the soul's journey through darkness. A beeswax candle wasn't just illumination, it was a lit offering, a glowing prayer, a physical presence in a spiritual space. Take the Paschal candle, for instance. Still used today during Easter Vigil, the Paschal candle is enormous, sometimes taller than the priest, and must be made of pure beeswax. Its lighting symbolizes Christ's resurrection, the light returning to the world. No pressure, candle. And let's not forget the Feast of Candlemas, celebrated every February 2nd. On this day, the Church blessed all the candles that would be used in the coming year. It was a big deal. People brought their own candles from home to be blessed, especially those meant to protect against storms or illness. Superstition? Maybe. Tradition? Definitely. Some households kept their Candlemas candle by the bed all year, lighting it during sickness, childbirth, or particularly loud thunderstorms. Historians still argue whether Candlemas evolved from earlier pagan fire festivals or emerged independently in Christian liturgy. The overlap is suspicious. Light, midwinter, purification themes, but concrete evidence is fuzzy. What's not in question is the economic impact. Candlemas sent demand for beeswax skyrocketing every winter. Good news for beekeepers, slightly less good for the bees. And beeswax wasn't just used in candles during worship. It also helped with rituals. When someone made a vow to God or a saint, they often offered a beeswax candle in the shape of the body part they hoped to heal. Got a bad knee? Leave a wax leg at the shrine. Eye infection, a tiny eyeball. There are entire storage rooms in European cathedrals, still filled with dusty boxes of wax hearts, ears, lungs, and yes, even wax posteriors. Devotion has no shame. Some of these ex voto candles were crude. Others were eerily lifelike, crafted by artisans who specialized in devotional anatomy. The wax offerings were burned slowly during vigils, their melting seen as a visible metaphor for suffering transferred, petition sent. Imagine kneeling as a wax foot burns in silence beside you, smoke curling up like prayer. A fringe tidbit. In some communities, women hoping to conceive would light a wax figure of a baby, complete with chubby limbs and swaddling. They believed the burning wax would warm the womb. Whether it worked is unclear, but the practice endured for centuries. Now, look above you. See those chandeliers? Those massive circular holders with dozens of taper candles? They weren't just for light. They were architectural halos, symbolic, spiritual, and wildly flammable. Cathedrals sometimes held entire ceremonies just to light them, dozens of monks chanting, the wax scent thick in the air, the dark ceiling glittering with trembling gold points like heaven drawn in candlelight. And then there were votive candles, small personal offerings, You lit one for your mother's health, or your brother's safe journey, or that sick donkey that carries water. Each one a private hope placed in a public space. People left coins by them, notes, sometimes even teeth, locks of hair, or tiny carved saints. It was candle magic with theological paperwork. Church records from the 13th century list entire professions of candle tenders, people whose full-time job was to trim wicks, gather stubs, remold leftovers, and relight flames. Wax recycling was common. Some churches had pots always on the boil in back rooms full of dripped wax waiting to be reborn. No flicker wasted. And remember, candles cost money. Pure beeswax was a luxury. Only the wealthiest churches could afford to burn it day and night. Smaller parishes might save their beeswax candles for Sunday Mass and substitute with stinky tallow during the week. Parishioners noticed. "The sweet smoke of saints," one priest wrote, "is traded for the fat of the field when coffers run dry." Occasionally, wax became currency in itself. Wealthy patrons donated vast quantities of beeswax to cathedrals, measured in pounds, not sticks. A noblewoman might offer 40 pounds of beeswax yearly for the souls of her kin. Not metaphorical pounds, literal, sticky, golden lumps. Some parishes listed wax on their tithe rolls alongside grain and sheep. And yes, wax theft was a thing. More than one monk was caught borrowing church wax to light his personal study or warm his sandals at night. One enterprising novice in York allegedly melted old altar stubs to make a little wax knight figurine army. He was caught and sentenced to kitchen duty until further notice. So next time you picture a medieval cathedral, stone arches, stained glass, heavenly chants, imagine the scent of beeswax in the air. Imagine the soft gold glow on stone columns. Imagine someone kneeling before a tiny flickering flame, asking for mercy or healing or maybe just a little hope. Because in the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, beeswax didn't just light the room, it lit the soul. You're in the back room of a stone-walled manor house, surrounded by shelves stacked with small scrolls, bundles of dried herbs, and jars sealed tight with cork, wax, or both. A fire crackles low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows over a cluttered writing desk. The person hunched over it isn't a priest or a noble. It's a medieval clerk, and he's muttering to himself while carefully dripping hot beeswax onto the end of a rolled-up parchment. This, dear listener, is the realm of seals, signatures, and wax diplomacy. Before everyone had a signature, and long before anyone had a fingerprint on file, seals were the definitive way to prove who you were, what you owned, and what you promised. And the best sealing medium? You already know the answer. Beeswax. Soft enough to take an impression, hard enough to hold it, durable enough to outlive generations if stored well. Paper fades, ink smudges, wax remembers. Let's start with the basics. You take your scroll or letter, Let's say it's a land deed, or a royal decree, or a slightly passive-aggressive message to a rival abbot, and roll it up. Then you drip a blob of warm beeswax onto the edge and press your seal into it. That seal might be engraved into a metal ring, a carved wooden stamp, or an ornate device called a matrix. The design is personal, a family crest, a saint, a mythological beast, or sometimes just your initials if you're low on imagination. The result? A little disc of hardened wax bearing your mark, proof that you made the document, approved it, and stood by its contents. Break the seal, and it's been tampered with. Try to forge it, and, well, good luck. These things were surprisingly detailed, and anyone important had clerks trained to spot the fakes. Historians still argue just how secure wax seals were. Some believe forgery was rampant, especially with stolen matrices. Others think seals were so heavily regulated, especially in royal and ecclesiastical circles, that any suspicious document was quickly exposed. Either way, entire legal systems were built around trusting the wax. There were different kinds of seals, too. The pendant seal hung from the bottom of a document by a cord or ribbon, often for royal or monastic use. The applied seal was pressed right onto the paper or parchment. Some were double-sided, with an impression on both the front and the back. Others were encased in protective wax casings, like tiny reliquaries. It was sealception, and size mattered. A king's seal might be the size of a teacup, covered in latin and lions. A lowly merchant seal might be no bigger than a grape. Nobles competed for elaborate designs. Some even scented their seals by mixing lavender or frankincense into the beeswax. Because if you're going to intimidate someone with a legal threat, you might as well make it smell divine. Then there's the curious case of wax color. While most beeswax was a warm golden hue, people began dyeing it. Red for royal decrees, green for property grants, black for mourning. One especially cranky bishop used a unique blue wax for excommunications. So, when his seal arrived, you knew you were in trouble before even opening the scroll. Medieval email headers, basically. A fringe tidbit. Some lovers sent secret messages with wax seals carved into heart shapes or bearing romantic symbols. One preserved example shows a rose pressed into pink-dyed wax, attached to a letter that reads, "To thee only, though our houses quarrel." Love letters and Game of Thrones drama. But sealing wasn't just about romance or war. It had an entire bureaucratic ecosystem. Royal courts employed chancellors of the seal, whose whole job was to guard, maintain, and witness the use of important matrices. In England, for example, the Great Seal authorized laws and treaties, while the Privy Seal handled personal royal correspondence. Each had its own wax, box, and entourage. And here's the kicker. Wax seals had legal weight. If a land dispute arose, showing a sealed document could win your case, provided the wax was intact and the seal was recognized. In some towns, you could even register your seal with the local guild or court, just to prevent confusion. Basically, a medieval version of notarization, but with more bees. For everyday folks, sealing wax became a way to protect property and reputation. Wills, dowry contracts, apprenticeships, and even recipes were sealed to show authenticity. One French widow left her beeswax seal to her daughter as part of her inheritance, that she may defend her name and bake in peace. Priorities. Some monks used beeswax to seal private confessions or visions written down for future reflection. These scrolls were sometimes buried with the monk or hidden in monastery walls. The idea was simple. If you sealed it with wax and faith, no one could question your intentions. And like all good things, seals had rituals. Documents were sometimes kissed after sealing. Candles were lit as they dried. In especially dramatic instances, entire court audiences watched as a nobleman pressed his ring into hot wax, followed by dramatic silence as if the wax itself had just spoken. Let's not forget wax's other diplomatic use: gifts. Sealed wax figures, often saints, doves, or symbolic creatures, were exchanged as tokens of alliance or peace. One German princess reportedly sent a wax peacock to her future husband as a symbol of loyalty and pride. It arrived partially melted. The marriage still happened. We assume no peacocks were discussed at the wedding. So tonight, if you're writing a letter, or let's be real, a text, you might spare a thought for the centuries of quiet clerks, whispering monks, and sharp-eyed chancellors who once leaned over desks just like yours. They knew that in a world of whispers, loyalty, and shifting power, sometimes all it took was a little wax to say everything. You're outside now, and the air smells of wet grass, pine smoke, and barn animals that haven't bathed since Pentecost. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith is hammering. A dog barks. A rooster gets confused and crows at the wrong hour. Welcome to the medieval homestead, where daily life is a blur of chores, improvised tools, and beeswax everywhere again. Because in between royal courts and cathedral vaults, beeswax was quietly solving problems on the medieval home front. From the farmyard to the hearth, it was the medieval version of WD-40. Sticky, fixable, dependable, and miraculously versatile. Let's start in the kitchen, where things are either boiling, smoking, or covered in soot. Storage was a constant struggle. You had no fridge, no Tupperware, no cling film. So how did you keep your cheese from becoming sentient, or your salted meat from growing its own fur? Answer: waxed cloth wraps. A thin piece of linen coated with melted beeswax made a reusable, moldable food cover. It repelled moisture, blocked air, and, importantly, didn't taste like sheep fat, unlike the tallow alternatives. You could press it over a bowl of broth, wrap it around half a wheel of cheese, or roll it into a pouch for dried herbs. It worked, it smelled nice, and it didn't attract rats. A rare trifecta. You also had waxed jars, stone or clay containers sealed with a cap of fabric and a wax ring. This was especially useful for things like jams, pickled onions, or medicinal syrups. Beeswax kept the contents fresh and the bugs out. It also let you hear the most medieval of complaints. Who broke the wax on the plum chutney again? In wealthier homes, you might even find wax-coated wooden spoons and utensils, which help prevent splinters and stains. Beeswax acted as a natural finish, water-repellent, and safe for food. Bonus, it gave everything a faint honey scent, which was deeply preferable to the ever-present background stench of vaguely goat. But let's move to clothing maintenance, because fashion stops for no plague. Shoe polish didn't exist, but beeswax served the same purpose. Rubbed into leather boots or belts, it softened, waterproofed, and protected them. Soldiers on campaign carried little wax cakes to treat their boots after muddy marches. Farmers did the same, especially in spring when mud season turned roads into pudding. And it wasn't just boots. Waxed cloaks were a thing. Before oilcloths became common, people would rub wax into canvas or linen capes to create a water-resistant layer. Not quite Gore-Tex, but better than shivering through a downpour with wet wool glued to your back. A quirky fringe use. Some folks dabbed wax onto threads before sewing to strengthen them and prevent fraying. This practice, called waxing the thread, is still used today by hand sewers and cobblers. Even medieval monks, when mending robes or stitching books, ran thread through a bit of wax first. So, next time you sew on a button, you're technically participating in a 1,000-year-old ritual. Now let's head out to the barn. Wax showed up in animal care, believe it or not. Some farmers used it to protect sheep wounds or seal small nicks on horses' hooves. There's even a record of beeswax being mixed with herbs to create an anti-fly balm for cows. You smear it on their ears and tails, and it repels insects, at least until the cow rolls in mud, which it inevitably does. And beeswax was used for tool maintenance, too. Iron tools rusted. A wax rub helped repel moisture and prevent corrosion, especially in winter when damp air crept into everything. It also made wooden handles smoother and less likely to crack. One blacksmith wrote, "A blade kept with wax shall not disgrace its wielder." Poetry and practicality. Now here's a domestic detail that's just so medieval. Wax seals for vermin holes. Yes, in homes where mice were a constant threat and food was precious, people sometimes sealed pantry holes or wall cracks with globs of beeswax mixed with flour and ash. It was a temporary fix. Mice eventually chewed through it, but it gave people a few more weeks of undisturbed flour storage. Better than leaving it to chance or to the cat, who was probably napping on the laundry. And beeswax didn't just protect objects, it scented the entire house. Even a single beeswax candle gave off a soft, sweet smell, far more pleasant than the usual aromas of garlic, smoke, and feet. Some wealthier households kept wax pomanders, small balls of wax infused with rose, clove, or cinnamon, hung in closets or tucked into drawers to keep linens from smelling like mildew and misery. Historians still argue whether these pomanders actually deterred insects or were just medieval air fresheners. Either way, they gave people the comforting illusion of control over their environment, something in short supply during flea season. A charming little use, sealing personal letters or poems, even between villagers. Not just nobles used wax seals, literate townsfolk, clergy, and merchants did too. One surviving letter from a 14th century baker to his sister includes a broken wax seal in the shape of a small apple, possibly a nod to their family orchard. "May this reach you sweeter than last season's cider," the letter begins. You can practically hear the smile, and just for fun, some kids used beeswax as medieval Play-Doh. They'd roll little figures, coins, or faces using leftover wax scraps from the candlemaker's table. A few carvings have survived, including a rather lumpy wax goat now housed in a London museum. It is not flattering, but it is adorable. So here in the quiet corners of ordinary life, beeswax worked its quiet magic. It didn't shine like gold or chant like monks, but it made things last longer, stay cleaner, smell better, work properly. And in a world where everything tried to break or spoil, that was a kind of everyday miracle. You're in a monastery now, not one of those grand cathedrals with flying buttresses and imported marble, but a quiet, practical place tucked into the hills, where the wind rustles through herb gardens and bells chime in the distance. The stone walls are cool. The corridors smell of ink, smoke, and beeswax. Lots and lots of beeswax. Because if there's one place in medieval life where beeswax reigned supreme, it was the monastery scriptorium, that sacred space where monks copied texts by hand, letter by meticulous letter, in near total silence. And beeswax wasn't just present, it was essential. You picture a monk, hood pulled low, hunched over a wooden desk. His quill scratches faintly as he inks a line of scripture. Beside him sits a wax tablet, a wooden frame filled with darkened beeswax, polished flat like a chalkboard. This, oddly enough, is where most monks drafted their words before committing them to vellum. Why wax tablets? Because parchment was expensive and mistakes were frowned upon. So instead of jumping straight into costly calfskin with ink that doesn't forgive, monks wrote rough versions on tablets using a stylus, often a pointed bit of bone or metal. Need to edit? No problem. Just warm the wax and smooth it over. Instant medieval delete key. Some wax tablets were bound like little books, diptychs or triptychs, and used not only for writing drafts, but also for taking notes, recording dates, and copying prayers. They were the medieval equivalent of a pocket notebook, except a lot stickier and more melt-prone. And speaking of melting, yes, accidents happened. A few records mention wax tablets left too close to candles, causing all the day's work to blur into an illegible soup. One novice allegedly tried to pass off the melted mess as divine interference. It did not go over well. But beeswax wasn't just under the stylus. It was in the tools themselves. Quills needed sharpening, and monks often rubbed them with wax to smooth the tip and reduce ink blotting. Some even waxed their fingers to avoid transferring oils to the pages. Manuscripts were fragile, and you didn't want your sweaty, ink-smudged thumbprints ruining 6 hours of illuminated lettering. And let's not forget the binding process. Once a manuscript was complete, the vellum sheets had to be sewn together and bound inside wooden covers, often wrapped in leather. Beeswax came in again, used to coat the thread, stiffen the stitching, and seal the inner spine. It strengthened the binding and prevented fraying, making sure the book could survive centuries of eager fingers and clumsy scholars. Sometimes monks also used beeswax in book preservation. A thin layer was occasionally applied to pages to protect pigments, especially in humid environments. Some pigments were temperamental. Verdigris, for instance, could eat through parchment over time. Wax helped slow the decay. That's right. Beeswax as early book insurance. A fringe tidbit for you. Some illuminated manuscripts actually incorporated colored wax into their decoration. Gold leaf was most common, of course, but red, green, and blue wax details were occasionally melted into margins or used to highlight sacred initials. The technique never caught on widely, probably because it was delicate and easy to smudge, but a few rare examples survive, glowing faintly even today. Now move deeper into the monastery, toward the altar preparation room. Here, beeswax appeared in yet another monastic task, making liturgical candles. Monks rolled wicks, melted wax, and poured it into molds for Mass. Some communities had specific candle-making days tied to saints' feasts or calendar transitions. One record reads, "On the eve of Michaelmas, the brothers made 100 candles, singing softly of fire and light." Historians still argue whether most monks made their own wax or bought it in bulk from nearby towns. Some abbeys had extensive beekeeping operations, others relied on donations or trade. But one thing's for certain, without beeswax, the rhythm of monastic life, its prayers, its texts, its quiet industry, would flicker and fade. And beeswax had other sacred uses in cloistered life. Sealing letters and scrolls, of course, with the abbey's unique crest, usually a saint, a cross, or a symbol from local legend. Monks used wax to mark correspondence, contracts, even recipes passed between monasteries. One such letter survives, a message from a German monk to his Irish counterpart, sealed with a wax rose, containing a recipe for fig preserves and a politely worded complaint about the unreliability of rain. Wax also factored into devotionals. Monks made tiny wax icons to place on personal altars or give as gifts during feast days. Some were molded into angels or lambs. Others bore inscriptions like Lux Mea, my light. In moments of solitude, a monk might light a single beeswax taper and sit in quiet reflection as it burned slowly down, the glow bouncing off manuscript pages and stone walls alike. And yes, beeswax appeared in the most practical of monastery moments too. A little rubbed on a stuck hinge, a drip added to a creaky floorboard, a dollop used to plug a drafty window. One monk's record from the 14th century reads simply, "Wax applied to the gap in the scriptorium wall, no longer hear the goats during evening prayers." But perhaps the most poetic use of beeswax in monastic life. Wax mixed with incense, used to create scented wafers that were burned during nighttime vigils. The scent, frankincense, myrrh, rose, sometimes cinnamon, rose with the prayers into the rafters. It was meant to calm the mind, lift the spirit, and remind the brotherhood of the sweetness of divine order. So there you are, deep in the monastery, wax tablet in hand, soft candle glow pooling on the desk, your thoughts half on the Gospel of John, and half on whether Brother Anselm has snuck the last of the fig paste. The wax is warm, the ink flows, the silence hums, and in this world of quiet discipline and reverent labor, beeswax holds everything together: letters, prayers, pages, lives. You're inside a tent now, not a lavish royal pavilion, but a rough field tent, canvas sides flapping gently in the wind, with the distant thunder of hooves and armor-clad bodies in motion. Welcome to the world of the medieval military campaign, where beeswax followed the army, not in song or ceremony, but as part of the gear that made war survivable. Because even in the mud and blood of battle, beeswax kept things dry, sealed, lit, and sometimes even alive. Let's start with armament care. A knight's sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a massive investment, practically an heirloom. And swords, like any metal tool, rusted. Soldiers and squires used beeswax to coat blades, arrowheads, and armor joints, forming a moisture-repelling barrier. Especially on long campaigns where rain, river crossings, or sweaty leather scabbards made rust a daily enemy, this wax coating meant the difference between a clean draw and a corroded mess. Even shields and wooden hafts got the treatment. Wax mixed with pitch or resin created a protective finish that sealed cracks, prevented splinters, and gave weapons a longer lifespan. Something you cared about a lot when replacements involved a blacksmith 5 towns away and a very distracted supply line. Now, look down at your boots. They've tramped through bogs, gravel roads, and possibly something unspeakable left behind by the cavalry. If you're lucky, someone back at camp has been rubbing beeswax into your leather soles and seams, keeping the water out and the material supple. Soldiers wrote about this constantly. One 14th century English footman called beeswax the balm of the march. And not just for feet. Horse tack, saddles, even tent seams got the same beeswax rub down. But wax wasn't just for maintenance. In the chaos of a campaign, writing mattered too. Commanders sent urgent letters, sealed with blobs of beeswax stamped by the family crest, a symbol of rank or the sigil of an order. These seals weren't just decorative, they proved authenticity. If you received an order sealed with Duke Alaric's griffin, you obeyed. If the seal was broken or looked odd, you got suspicious. Forging wax seals during wartime was treason, plain and simple, and some armies carried portable seal boxes, complete with stamps, wax, and wicks, for rapid correspondence on the go. A fringe tidbit. Some captains used colored wax to mark the urgency or nature of a message. Red meant attack. Green meant regroup. Blue was for supplies or neutral communiques. One preserved scroll from a Breton campaign includes the phrase, "Seal this in red, for it concerns the siege." And yes, when the sun dipped and the torches sputtered, beeswax came to the rescue again. Campaign life after dark was rough. Tallow candles smoked too much. Oil lamps spilled. But beeswax candles, even small handmade ones, burned cleanly and evenly. Officers kept them in travel chests, monks in supply carts, and the more superstitious soldiers tucked tiny stubs of wax candles blessed by monks into their satchels, hoping the light would protect them in battle. Spiritual insurance. Let's shift now to field medicine, which was, let's call it, experimental. But even here, beeswax had its place. Medieval medics used it to seal wounds, especially large gashes or post-surgical sites. When melted and poured carefully over a stitched wound, beeswax acted as a kind of early bandage. It protected the injury from dirt, slowed bleeding, and even offered mild antibacterial benefits. A 15th century surgeon named Theodoric of Lucca recommended a wax and oil salve for arrow wounds, claiming it softens pain and keeps corruption at bay. Historians still argue whether this was a placebo or an actual medical advance, but some modern studies suggest beeswax's mild antiseptic properties might have helped, at least more than, say, stuffing wounds with moss or ashes. More medically curious? Wax was sometimes used to mold prosthetics, temporary noses, fingers, or ears, fashioned from stiffened cloth and beeswax, especially for injured nobles expected to return to courtly life. One German knight is recorded as wearing a wax nose fitted to a strap that looped around his ears. It was pale, slightly lumpy, and reportedly scared children, but it worked. But perhaps the most evocative military use of beeswax? Votive figures and battlefield offerings. Before battle, some soldiers would light small wax candles or burn wax figurines shaped like saints, swords, or doves, each one a symbolic prayer. "May St. George guard my sword arm," one note read, attached to a wax figurine found buried near an old battlefield in France. These rituals weren't official, but they were widespread, half faith, half superstition, fully human. In certain nightly orders, beeswax offerings were sent back home in exchange for prayers. A commander might order the creation of a wax replica of the Virgin, wrapped in linen and sent to a monastery, asking the brothers to pray for a safe campaign. Think of it like medieval crowdfunding, but with candles instead of coin. And beeswax made its way into battlefield records, too. After a victory, commanders or scribes might seal their reports with elaborate wax seals, symbolizing the triumph and the restoration of order. A few such seals still exist, one showing a knight triumphant over a dragon, another depicting a burning tower, possibly an accurate depiction, possibly medieval drama. These reports weren't just about glory. They were legal records for land claims, ransoms, and spoils. And without that wax seal, they didn't count. Lastly, let's return to the personal level. A soldier alone at the edge of camp might sit by a guttering fire, patching a torn boot, sealing a cracked canteen, or lighting a beeswax stub to read a smudged letter from home. In that moment, beeswax wasn't a miracle or a mystery. It was just one more small thing that held the world together, a barrier against rust, a flicker in the dark, a seal against chaos. So while the battlefield roared and banners flew and war horses galloped, beeswax stayed quiet. But it was there, in the gear, the wounds, the whispers, the waxen prayers, making the violence slightly less brutal, the cold slightly less bitter, and the distance from home a little more bearable. You're in a small shop now, low-ceilinged, smoky, and cluttered with bins of herbs, bundles of feathers, and shelves lined with tiny bottles and powders. No signs hang outside. No prices are posted. This is an apothecary's den, somewhere between doctor's office, chemist's lab, and local gossip hub. And tucked among the vials and parchments is a well-worn block of beeswax, because in medieval medicine, beeswax was as trusted as any tonic or tincture. Let's start with something surprisingly modern. Skincare. Yep, beeswax wasn't just for wounds and candles. Apothecaries used it to make ointments, balms, and salves, many of which were applied to dry skin, cracked heels, sunburns, or occasionally to what medieval texts call the wind-ravaged face, a fancy way of saying chapped cheeks. The wax helped soothe, seal, and protect, locking in moisture long before moisturizers became a billion-dollar industry. A basic salve recipe: beeswax melted with olive oil and a touch of rose water, maybe a crushed herb like chamomile or calendula. Let it cool, rub it on, and voila, you've just made 14th century lotion. But the medicinal uses go deeper, literally. Beeswax was a key ingredient in plasters and poultices, often applied to the chest or limbs for various ailments. Mix warm wax with crushed mustard seed, wrap it in cloth, and press it to the chest to treat a stubborn cough. Or, for sore joints, add frankincense and myrrh, believed to drive out cold humors. Historians still argue whether these treatments offered real relief or were mostly placebos warmed by belief. Some modern herbalists point to beeswax's anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. Others say the warmth and ritual of the application did more good than the ingredients themselves. Either way, medieval patients swore by them, especially when the alternative was leeches. Beeswax was also used to mold pills. Before capsules or tablets, medicine had to be shaped somehow, and beeswax was perfect for encasing bitter herbs, ground stones, or crushed beetles. Yes, beetles. We don't recommend trying that at home. Pharmacists rolled these little wax pills by hand, sometimes flavoring them with honey or mint to make them less awful. One record even mentions pills shaped like tiny animals to encourage sick children to take their medicine. Medieval pediatrics bribed them with wax, a fringe tidbit. Some potions were sealed with wax to lock in potency. The belief was that air diluted the essence of an elixir, so bottles of rare tonics like mandrake wine or powdered unicorn horn, don't ask, were corked and then sealed with beeswax to trap the virtue inside. Some of these bottles have been excavated centuries later, still sealed tight. But what about internal use? Would they eat beeswax? Generally, no, not intentionally. While beeswax was technically edible in small amounts, it wasn't prized for taste or digestion. That said, in emergency hunger times, people chewed wax to trick the stomach. Think of it like medieval gum. Soldiers on campaign, pilgrims during lean seasons, and even fasting monks sometimes gnawed on wax to ease hunger pangs. It didn't fill the belly, but it gave the jaw something to do and the mind something to believe. Back in the apothecary's room, beeswax played another odd role: medicine labels. Before printed paper or ink that wouldn't smudge, some jars had tiny wax seals pressed with symbols or letters to indicate their contents. One jar might bear a wax S for sage, another a wax B for honeycomb remedies. This way, even the illiterate could navigate the medicine shelf. Function meets charm. Beeswax even crept into magico-medical practice. Some healers shaped tiny wax effigies of their patients, especially for persistent ailments, and then melted them slowly while chanting prayers. The idea? Transfer the sickness from flesh to wax and destroy it. Medieval psychosomatic therapy, if you squint. One German text describes a ritual where wax was shaped into a diseased liver, smeared with ash, and burned at dawn while calling on Saint Wolfgang. The patient, we're told, felt his bile calm before the rooster crowed thrice. Make of that what you will. Even in surgery, a terrifying prospect at the best of times, beeswax made appearances. Wax-coated linen strips were sometimes used as makeshift bandages, especially for wounds that needed to be sealed against dirt and dampness. The wax prevented sticking and added a mild layer of protection. Surgeons also used wax to plug bullet wounds once firearms became common. Soft wax could be molded to fit a ragged hole and later removed as the wound healed. And for those with more permanent injuries, beeswax helped shape prosthetics and supports. A lost finger could be replaced with a wax-covered wood replica, polished smooth to reduce irritation. One nobleman reportedly commissioned a full-hand prosthetic with a beeswax palm for comfort, designed not just for show, but for grasping a goblet at feasts without drawing stares. In monasteries, infirmarians sometimes used wax to preserve rare herbs, dipping petals or roots in warm wax to seal in scent and potency. These wax-preserved plants were stored in cool chambers and later shaved into teas or added to infusions. It's one of the earliest known methods of botanical preservation, and a few records hint at wax-dipped mandrake roots kept for decades. Finally, let's not forget scent and comfort. When patients were near death or simply very ill, wax tablets infused with aromatic herbs were placed near their heads to ease breathing and mask unpleasant odors. Lavender, rosemary, and sometimes pine were common. One French physician wrote, "A wax rose beside the bed soothes the last hour." So here, surrounded by tinctures and tools, you realize beeswax wasn't some magical cure-all, but it was a gentle constant, soothing, sealing, softening, helping patients breathe, soldiers mend, apothecaries measure, and herbalists preserve. Not dramatic, not flashy, but in a world where every illness felt like a gamble, beeswax helped stack the odds a little more kindly. Now step carefully. You're in the quiet, echoing heart of a medieval courtroom. It's not the loud, gavel-slamming kind you might picture. This is a solemn chamber, lined with wooden benches, arched ceilings, and rows of watching faces. A scribe dips his pen. A bailiff shifts his weight. And in front of the judge sits a sealed scroll, marked with thick golden wax. Because in the world of medieval law and litigation, beeswax didn't just support truth, it quite literally sealed it. In an age before filing cabinets, digital records, or email threads that mysteriously vanish, beeswax seals were the most powerful proof you could hold in your hands. If your contract, agreement, or accusation had no wax, well, good luck convincing anyone it mattered. Let's begin with something deceptively simple. Land ownership. Medieval land deals were labyrinthine. Titles passed through families, changed hands via marriages, gifts, and bribes. To prevent disputes, or at least win them, documents proving ownership had to be sealed. These were long scrolls, often written in Latin, and always finalized with a large wax blob stamped by the parties involved. Lords had family seals. Abbeys had ecclesiastical sigils. Even towns had official seals kept under lock and key. Without a seal, the deed might be deemed void. If someone tried to forge a seal, they risked fines, imprisonment, or a very public shaming involving rotten vegetables and stockades. Wax wasn't just practical, it was legal identity in hardened form. A quirky detail, in some towns you could store your official seal at the local church, under the care of a neutral witness. This prevented tampering and made sure you couldn't deny a deal by pretending you'd lost your matrix. Medieval excuses had limits, and seals weren't only about land. Marriage contracts, trade agreements, guild memberships, vassal oaths, and even confession records, yes, really, could be sealed with wax. Once applied, the seal represented finality. That's it. No takebacks, just the judgment of time and possibly God. There's a famous case from 1274 where two brothers in Normandy fought over inheritance. One had a sealed letter from our late father, while the other claimed it was forged. The court summoned local clergy, who examined the wax for inconsistencies, bubble patterns, edge smudges, hair embedded in the stamp. It sounds absurd, but these were serious tactics. In the end, the document was ruled genuine. The seal had aged appropriately. Historians still argue whether the judgment was just or whether the winning brother had a friend in the chancery. And yes, the wax itself became a kind of courtroom exhibit. People would pass it around, squint at it, compare it to known samples. Imagine jurors in robes inspecting a lump of golden wax like it held the key to truth. Because, in a way, it did. Beyond seals, beeswax was also used in legal administration. Court scribes used wax tablets to jot down witness statements, tally fines, and record attendance. These weren't final records, just drafts, but they were often heated, smoothed, and reused day after day. Like the medieval version of a dry erase board, only with better longevity and significantly more bees. A fringe tidbit. In some ecclesiastical courts, penitents confessed sins to clerics who recorded penance conditions, fasts, pilgrimages, alms, and sealed them with wax. These sealed slips were sometimes handed back to the confessor, who had to present them at a church later to prove they'd fulfilled their spiritual sentence. Yes, Father, I did walk to St. Edmund's barefoot. Here's the wax to prove it. Then there were the wax fines. Not all penalties were paid in coin. In smaller parishes or rural courts, some wrongdoers were required to pay their fines in kind, including a certain amount of beeswax. You might be told, for slandering your neighbor's sheep, you owe the abbey 1 pound of wax for the altar. It was practical. It was symbolic. And, in some cases, it supported the church's lighting budget. Records show entire towns tallying annual wax dues owed to the bishopric, used for candles, seal-making, and divine intercession all at once. So, sin didn't just light up your conscience, it also lit up the sanctuary. Now, imagine a courtroom drama. A merchant accuses a noble of backing out of a shipment deal. The scroll is presented. A hush falls. The seal is unbroken. The merchant nods. The judge leans in. Let the seal be read. And when the scribe unwinds the scroll and holds up the wax disk for all to see, there's a moment of strange reverence, because that lump of wax carries the full weight of truth, trust, and perhaps treachery. Some seals even bore portraits or symbols as intimidation. A night seal might depict him holding a sword in one hand and a cross in the other. A bishop's might show the gates of heaven with the not-so-subtle message, break this seal and risk damnation. Wax had flair, and it wasn't just men. Noblewomen, abbesses, and queens had their own seals and used them. A surviving letter from Eleanor of Aquitaine is sealed with a lion's head surrounded by stars. It's still perfectly intact nearly 900 years later. Try getting your inkjet printer to manage that. Lastly, court clerks often recycled wax. Once a case was resolved, old wax from dismissed scrolls might be melted down to make candles or seal newer documents. Justice may have been blind, but it wasn't wasteful. So as the courtroom empties and the judge's voice fades into murmurs and rustling robes, think of how many truths in history were pinned not by swords or speeches, but by a warm drop of wax and a steady hand with a seal. In an age where every word could be questioned, wax offered certainty, solidity, and just the faintest scent of honeyed permanence. You're in a merchant's booth now, half market stall, half alchemist's nook. The air buzzes with voices haggling over wool, spices, and salted fish. But here, tucked behind bolts of linen and clay jars of dye, are little golden bricks of beeswax wrapped in cloth, each stamped with a mark that says, "This came from somewhere important." Because in the sprawling web of medieval trade and economy, beeswax wasn't just barter. It was a bona fide currency of trust. Let's back up. Picture the medieval world as a network of towns, fairs, ports, and dusty roads. And somewhere in all that, people are trying to exchange value without the convenience of coins or clear banking systems. Enter beeswax. Why beeswax? First, it kept well. It didn't rot, mildew, or spoil like grain or cheese. Second, it had intrinsic utility. Everyone needed wax for lighting, sealing, preserving, polishing, even healing. Third, it had a kind of quiet prestige. Tallow was for peasants. Beeswax meant quality. So it started slipping into deals, not just as a product, but as a medium of exchange. In towns short on minted coin, people paid debts, rents, and dues in wax. A landlord might accept 5 pounds of beeswax instead of silver. A monastery might list its tithe obligations as 4 lambs, 3 hens, and a stone of wax. Royal courts kept inventory scrolls where wax appeared next to spices and wine. It was that valuable, and not just locally. Beeswax was a cross-border commodity. Eastern Europe, especially what's now Ukraine and Belarus, had vast forests and wild hives, producing wax in industrial quantities. Merchants along the Hanseatic trade routes, A network of North Sea and Baltic ports shipped tons of this wax westward to cities like London, Bruges, and Cologne. A single barrel could light a cathedral or seal a year's worth of documents. Traders guarded these barrels like treasure. One London customs record from 1382 lists beeswax arriving from Riga, taxed at a higher rate than wine. Historians still argue whether this reflected scarcity or just bureaucratic pricing schemes. But either way, it shows how serious wax trade had become. And yes, there was wax fraud. Shady merchants sometimes mixed beeswax with cheaper animal fats or pine resin. The results looked fine, but burned badly, smelled worse, and ruined seals. So guilds in major cities established wax inspection rules. A wax guildmaster would slice into bricks and sniff for impurities. Some even used hot knife tests, watching how the wax melted. Pure beeswax had a clean, slow drip. Adulterated wax bubbled or hissed. A fringe tidbit. One medieval guidebook warned buyers to beware of wax softened by goat tallow and perfumed to mask its crime. Which, honestly, sounds like the title of a murder mystery. Cities had their own wax standards. Paris had white wax for church use, yellow wax for household use, and brown wax for everything else. Traders marked wax blocks with stamps indicating origin, some from known apiaries, others from abbeys or royal estates. These marks worked like medieval branding, guaranteeing quality and building reputation. If your wax bore the B and cross of Abbey St. Martin, everyone knew it would burn long and clean. Even royal treasuries stocked wax like bullion. In England, the Exchequer recorded how many stones of wax, a stone being 14 pounds, were stored for legal and ceremonial use. In lean years, records show wax being borrowed from churches or repurposed from unused candles. Basically, a medieval version of juggling budget lines. And here's where things get poetic. In some places, wax was weighed alongside justice. At the annual Candlemas Fair, held each February, merchants sold beeswax in bulk to churches preparing for the season of Lent. The event was part market, part religious festival, and some towns required every trader to donate a portion of wax to the local cathedral before they could open a stall, lighting the sacred before lighting their pockets. In villages, wax was even used as a dowry component. One marriage record from 15th century Germany lists 1 bed, 2 gowns, and 6 ounces of cathedral-grade beeswax as part of the bride's inheritance. Symbolic? Sure. Practical? Absolutely. Wax meant warmth, security, and status. Let's talk shipping. Because wax was heavy, fragile in heat, and prone to theft, merchants often wrapped it in waxed linen, tied with twine, and marked with a seal. Invoices noted not just weight, but purity by sniff and scrape. A standard you will unfortunately not find on modern shipping labels. Some caravans even employed wax tasters. Yes, actual professionals who tested samples before approving the shipment, and the wax economy went both ways. Apiarists, those who kept bees, could earn a tidy income selling to traders or lords. Some peasants paid their taxes in wax harvested from wild hives. Others bartered with traveling monks. Wax for scripture, as one abbey log records, referring to beeswax exchanged for a copied prayer scroll. Faith and flame, one trade at a time. Oh, and let's not forget seasonal demand spikes. At Easter, for example, every church needed a paschal candle, usually a huge pillar of beeswax, sometimes as tall as a person. Demand skyrocketed. Prices rose. Wax hoarding happened. One merchant was fined in 1421 for hoarding 4 barrels of holy wax to drive up prices. Proof that market manipulation is older than Wall Street. And yes, even in death, wax had economic weight. Funeral rites often required candles to be burned for days. Wealthy families commissioned wax figurines to be placed around coffins. The bigger the display, the more expensive the beeswax, and the more neighbors knew just how beloved or rich the deceased had been. So here in the heartbeat of the medieval market, amid bells and barter, beeswax glows quietly, not flashy like gold, not intoxicating like wine, but steady, trusted, and always in demand. A commodity that lit the night, sealed the deal, and kept the wheels of economy turning one sweet-scented brick at a time. You're in a grand cathedral now. The nave stretches into darkness, echoing with silence. Light filters through high stained glass, painting the floor in reds and blues. Incense hangs in the air. And just below the altar, a single thick beeswax candle flickers, its soft, steady glow more powerful than any sermon. Because in the medieval church, beeswax wasn't decoration. It was symbol, sacrifice, and sacred duty, all rolled into one warm, golden stick of flame. Let's start with the basics. Beeswax candles were the gold standard for religious settings. Unlike smoky, greasy tallow candles, beeswax burned clean and bright, without the smell of old stew. That made it the ideal choice for chapels, relic rooms, altars, and anywhere holiness needed a little help from lighting. Every church, from the tiniest roadside shrine to the sprawling Gothic cathedrals, relied on beeswax for ritual and rhythm. Morning Mass, evening Vespers, holy days, each had its own lighting script, and beeswax was the medium. In a very literal sense, it lit the way to God. There were even rules, a lot of them. Canon law required that candles used during Mass and on the altar be pure beeswax. No tallow mixes allowed. The Church believed beeswax was not only cleaner, but theologically pure. Made by virgin bees, it was a symbol of Mary. The steady flame represented Christ, the wick, his soul, the melting wax, his body, given for the faithful. It was theology with a heat source. One common requirement, the Paschal candle, lit every Easter. This enormous pillar, sometimes over 6 feet tall, was made entirely of beeswax, decorated with symbols of Christ, and lit from a sacred fire. It stayed burning throughout the Easter season, sometimes for 50 days straight, depending on the parish budget and wind conditions. A fringe tidbit. Some churches actually measured time by how long these candles burned. Before mechanical clocks were common, monks tracked the day in candelae, units of time based on inches of candle consumed. 1 hour, give or take a drip. And if you're wondering where all that wax came from, well, the church had a system. Faithful lay people were expected to donate beeswax as part of their alms. On holy days, especially Candlemas, February 2nd, people brought wax to be blessed, measured, and melted into new candles. It was both an offering and a form of spiritual insurance. A pound of wax might light your prayer, or reduce your time in purgatory. Richer patrons could commission custom candles, sometimes in their own likeness. Yep, wax effigies. One duchess ordered a candle shaped like her, kneeling in prayer, arms clasped forever in devotion. It stood in the cathedral for decades. Other patrons had entire chandeliers made from beeswax, decorated with gold leaf and tiny icons. Medieval lighting wasn't always subtle. And then there were the miracle candles, those that supposedly burned for days without shortening, or relit themselves mysteriously, or gave off the scent of roses. Historians still argue whether these were accidents, embellishments, or a clever mix of extra oil and hopeful storytelling. One bishop wrote in his diary, "The candle burned through the night untouched by wax's hunger. I can find no trick in it, yet neither do I credit angels." Either way, miracles or not, candles meant presence. During funerals, dozens might be lit to honor the dead. For processions, acolytes carried tapers ahead of relics or banners. In exorcisms, a circle of beeswax candles was sometimes arranged around the afflicted. The flame didn't just illuminate, it protected, sanctified, transformed. And when the candles were snuffed, the stubs, called blessed remnants, weren't thrown away. They were melted into new holy objects, stored for emergencies, or even buried with the dead. One priest requested that a candle that lit my first Mass light my last rest. His church obliged. Beeswax even played a role in monastic penance. Some monks, especially in stricter orders, were required to make their own candles as an act of humility. From tending hives to melting wax to dipping wicks, it was spiritual labor. The idea, if you want to pray by candlelight, be willing to suffer the bees. And yes, there were beekeeping monasteries that became famous for their wax. Abbeys like Cluny, Citeaux, and Glastonbury managed entire hives just to meet liturgical demand. Their wax was considered purer, holier, even, if you believe the marketing, brighter. They sold it in bricks stamped with tiny saints, shipped it across kingdoms, and guarded their recipes like holy relics. A poetic use. During Lent, when the world dimmed and music went quiet, some cathedrals reduced all lighting to a single candle before the altar. People came just to sit in that gentle glow, to let the silence seep into them. One chronicler writes, "The flame spoke louder than the priest. In its warmth we remembered the promise of spring." And beeswax made its way into church art too. Some votive offerings were cast entirely in wax. Tiny wax feet for healing leg pain, wax infants for prayers over sick children, even wax livestock for better harvests. These were placed near saint shrines or hung from chapel rafters like sleepy mobiles of human hope. But not all candles were large and ceremonial. Sometimes, in the hush of a side chapel, a widow lit a single beeswax taper and whispered the name of a loved one. In that moment, the candle was not a theological metaphor or church inventory item. It was memory, warmth, grief. So as you walk slowly through the cathedral, past arches carved by lost hands and floors worn smooth by centuries of feet, the light from beeswax still flickers. It casts shadows on stone saints, dances over gold altarpieces, and settles into the folds of old prayers. No fanfare, no shouting, just the steady promise of light in the dark, flame as faith, and wax as the vessel. Now, you're not in a church or battlefield or apothecary's hut. You're at a feast. Long trestle tables creak under the weight of trenchers, pies, and flagons of mead. There's music in the air, lutes, laughter, the occasional bark of a drunk noble, and above it all, dripping gently into polished holders, are dozens of beeswax candles glowing like miniature suns, because in the halls of the wealthy, beeswax was luxury, and everyone knew it.
Let's be clear. Tallow was for peasants. It smoked, it stank, it attracted insects, and sometimes exploded with a sizzle if the fat wasn't rendered right. Beeswax? Beeswax was refined, prestigious, and expensive. So expensive that simply burning it during a dinner was a status flex, like wearing ermine or owning more than one bathtub. In noble households, lighting was part of interior design, even if that term didn't exist yet. Chandeliers of iron or wood hung above banquet tables, dripping with beeswax tapers. Wall sconces glowed. Candles floated in bowls of scented water. Some servants were tasked with trimming wicks and rotating candles to ensure an even burn, because heaven forbid your guests think you ran out of clean wax halfway through the roast goose. The wax itself? Often custom blended. Wealthier estates added herbs or essential oils, lavender, rosemary, sometimes rose, to their candles. The scent signaled refinement. Guests commented, and yes, beeswax candles were gifted, hoarded, and counted like coin. A record from a 15th century English manor lists 12 rolls of wax for dining chamber only, not to be touched by kitchen staff. And speaking of kitchens, wax even touched the food. Not directly, though that happened too,
but in the form of molded decorations. Beeswax was used to create miniature sculptures, flowers, fruits, even symbolic animals to decorate platters. These were dyed with natural pigments and arranged to impress diners before being whisked away. One Italian noble's wedding feast included a wax replica of the family crest, an eagle clutching a turnip perched beside every roast. A fringed tidbit. At some royal feasts, wax was molded into edible disguises. Think roast pheasant dressed up to look like a peacock, complete with wax feathers and gold-painted beak. No one ate the wax, of course, unless they were trying to impress a lady or win a bet. And let's not forget gift culture. Beeswax candles were a diplomatic staple. When nobles visited other courts, they often brought finely made candles, sometimes carved with personal emblems or wrapped in embroidered linen. One countess even commissioned a box of candles shaped like swans, each one hollow and filled with perfume. These were meant to be burned in the bath because, yes, medieval rich people took mood lighting seriously. But it wasn't all about feasting and flexing. Beeswax also marked rites of passage in the noble world. At births, a candle might be lit during labor and left to burn until the child's first bath. For baptisms, tiny wax tapers were given as keepsakes, sometimes pressed with a saint's image, sometimes the baby's initials. At coming-of-age ceremonies, a young noble might light their first candle as a symbol of stepping into duty. The flame didn't just illuminate the room, it told a story. And then, of course, there were weddings. Candles lined the aisle. Beeswax wreaths hung over the altar. Some traditions included melting wax to bind two small figures together, symbolic unity in sticky form. In certain regions, the couple kept a beeswax candle lit for the first week of marriage. If it went out early, well, the in-laws had opinions. One preserved tradition from Burgundy had the bride and groom carve initials into a wax block during the reception, then seal it in a box with dried flowers to be opened on their 10th anniversary, unless they got divorced first, in which case the wax got melted down for someone else's nuptials. Economical and slightly petty. Historians still argue whether these wax customs were widespread or just regional curiosities recorded because they were so charming. But enough records survive to say beeswax had a ceremonial role far beyond the church. Even in leisure and art, the upper classes dabbled with wax. Some noble women kept wax modeling kits for crafting miniature sculptures. It was considered a proper pastime, delicate, meditative, and easy to clean up. Letters from noble courts mention ladies crafting wax flowers, saints, even dioramas of their estates. The really ambitious ones added powdered gold or dyed threads for embellishment. One Spanish princess reportedly sculpted an entire chess set from scented beeswax. Sadly, only the rook survives. And in moments of grief, yes, even nobles grieved, beeswax played a final part. At funerals, Processions were led by candle bearers holding thick beeswax torches. Family members lit votive candles and placed them at the grave. Some kept a mourning candle burning at home for days or weeks. The wealthiest families commissioned wax effigies of the deceased, life-sized, painted, and eerily lifelike, to be displayed during memorial services. Creepy? Maybe, but it gave people something tangible to mourn. In fact, a wax effigy of Henry VII remained on display in Westminster Abbey for centuries after his death. It wore his clothes. It carried a scepter. It looked like he might start breathing again any moment, which is exactly the effect they were going for. And even after all the grandeur, the rituals, the carefully molded swans and golden tapers, beeswax had one more quiet role: memory. A widow lighting a beeswax taper in her husband's empty chair. A noble lighting a candle for a child gone too soon. A servant saving the stub of a wedding candle not for ceremony, but for warmth on a cold night. Because no matter how grand the hall, how lavish the feast, or how noble the name, everyone in the end needs a little light. And that's what beeswax gave them: warmth without smoke, flame without fanfare, memory without words. In a world of darkness and ceremony, it glowed steady, soft, and golden. You're alone now. The feast has ended. The chapel bells have gone quiet. The market's long since packed up. It's night in the medieval world, thick, quiet, and almost completely dark. Except, of course, for one thing: a single beeswax candle flickering gently on a wooden table, casting golden ripples over parchment, pewter, and sleep-heavy stone. And this, really, is where beeswax was always meant to be, not in the noise and ceremony, but here, keeping company with stillness. Because when all the grand uses are set aside, the royal seals, the battlefield bandages, the sculpted swans, it was the daily, humble glow of beeswax that meant the most. It stood between you and the dark, between a late-night prayer and a stumble into the fireplace. It lit your copy of the Psalter, your carving of a whistle, your inked letters to distant friends. Beeswax didn't just illuminate, it accompanied. Take the scribe, hunched at his desk. He's been copying lines for hours. His quill scratches rhythmically, dipping again and again into ink thinned with wine. Beside him, a beeswax taper gutters faintly, pooled at the base with yellow drips like soft petals. If he's lucky, the wax is pure and slow burning. If he's poorer, the candle's short and quick to spit. But it's enough. Enough to finish this passage. Enough to keep the words visible for just one more line. In homes, especially in winter, a single beeswax candle might be the only source of light for an entire evening. Families gathered around it to tell stories, patch clothes, or simply sit. Children stared into the flame until their eyes watered. Mothers pressed wax into leaky jars. Fathers softened waxed thread to repair boots. The flame gave no speeches. It just stayed. In many homes, candle ends, called blessings in some folk traditions, were saved and melted down again. Nothing was wasted. If a stub burned too low, it was floated in oil. If it broke, it was warmed between fingers and reset in a new wick. The candle lived on. Light was a form of thrift, and in the quiet hours of night, beeswax gave the most precious gift of all, time. Time to write a few more words, time to finish a prayer, time to think, grieve, love, or simply be. Even an hour of golden light felt like a miracle in a world ruled by the sun and silenced by its setting. Some believed beeswax candles helped guide dreams. A taper lit before sleep was said to protect the soul from nightmares or call forth messages from saints. One poem from the 13th century describes a dreamer visited by a bee of flame who whispered truths. Mystical? Sure. But in a world full of shadows, people reached for what little clarity they could. A fringe detail. In some folk traditions, a piece of beeswax was shaped into a small disc and slipped under the pillow to soften the sleep. Whether that meant dreams, sin, or literal neck pain is unclear, but it's a lovely thought. And still, scholars debate. Was beeswax really the candle of purity, as priests claimed, or just the most accessible clean-burn material in a world of smoke and soot? Was its high status earned or inflated by centuries of church preference? Did the average peasant burn beeswax, or just watch it glow in someone else's chapel? These are fair questions. Historians don't always agree, but one thing's certain. Beeswax was everywhere, in ways both big and small. It carried letters. It healed wounds. It framed the dead and brightened the living. It was a luxury, a tool, a ritual, a comfort. And it endures. Open a drawer in an old monastery. Find a stub of wax, still faintly scented. Touch a parchment edge and feel the seal that hasn't crumbled in centuries. Light a beeswax candle today and watch the same slow golden flicker seen by scribes, queens, foot soldiers, and forgotten children. And maybe, just maybe, if you listen closely, you'll hear them in the flame. Now let the images dim. The candle gutters low, its pool of light shrinking to a soft golden halo. The medieval world fades with it, slowly, gently. The clang of forges, the chant of monks, the rustle of parchment, they all fall silent. You're left with warmth, wax, a wick, and the slow rhythm of breath. Imagine you're lying in a small chamber, high in the rafters of an abbey. Cold stone walls cradle you. Wind hums gently through the cracks. But at your side, a beeswax candle glows steady, casting soft amber light across a worn wooden floor. It smells faintly of honey, old prayers, and something like sunlight preserved. Its flame is no longer history's witness, or religion's servant, or a noble's pride. Now it's just a quiet companion, a soft anchor between waking and rest. Let your thoughts drift like smoke, upward, outward, away. No need to hold on to names or facts or timelines now. The seals are pressed. The scrolls are stored. The stories have been told. All that's left is stillness and a little golden light. Good night.